All right, so as Greg said, I'm Claire Fricks. I'm with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. I'm an agricultural runoff specialist. So I deal primarily with the CAFO operations in the state of Wisconsin. My role essentially is to regulate and permit those CAFO operations. I also respond to any spills or complaints that happen. So like I said, my main goal or role in the state of Wisconsin is to regulate and permit CAFO operations. Currently, I'm covering Eau Claire County, Dunn, Jackson, and Trempealeau. I also have some business cards on the table here, so if anyone has questions for me after this meeting, feel free to pick one of those up and give me a call or send me an email. Okay, so I guess let's get started. You just want me to let you know when to switch the slides? Okay. So I'm going to start by talking about what is a CAFO. So the DNR kind of puts them into two different categories. We have large CAFO operations, which are operations that have 1,000 animal units or more. And because of this size, we require that they have a WPDES permit. And a WPDES permit is a Wisconsin Pollutant Discharge Elimination Systems permit. And we also have small or medium-sized operations. So these are operations that have less than 1,000 animal units, but they are designated by the department as needing a WPDES permit based on past discharges. So those are the two categories of CAFO operations. Next slide. Okay, so how do we determine how many animal units an operation has? This is the worksheet that we use by the department. There are two separate calculations on this worksheet. We have the total number of mixed animal units as well as non-mixed animal units. The non-mixed animal units are what are used under the federal regulations. So we include that on our worksheet. We also include the mixed animal units, and as part of the state of Wisconsin, we use both of these animal unit calculations to determine the size of an operation. So what the farm would need to do is they need to enter the amount of animals that they have for each of those animal types, then multiply it by that equivalency factor, and those equivalency factors are based on the size of an animal and the estimated amount of waste that they're probably going to produce. Because if you look at it, a cow is not the same as what a chicken would be in terms of waste production. So that's why we have these equivalency factors. And then once they actually go through and determine these calculations, the state of Wisconsin will use the largest of the two to determine what the size of the operation is. So if it comes out that they have 1,000 animal units or more, they must apply for a WPDES permit. Now I'll talk about some of the standard requirements of NR 243. NR 243 is the code for animal feeding operations. This is where DNR gets its authority to permit and regulate CAFO operations. The purpose of this chapter is essentially to implement design standards, accepted management practices, and kind of gives us the basis for permit requirements for a CAFO operation. So one of the most important things within NR 243 that we kind of incorporate into our permits is this discharge limitation. So we like to say, and from the department side, that zero discharge under very limited circumstances is allowed from a CAFO operation. So for most CAFO operations, these operations may not discharge manure or process wastewater to navigable waters from the production area unless all of these criteria have been met. So these are the very limited circumstances that I'm talking about for a discharge to be allowed. So the discharge must be a cause from a precipitation event that causes an overflow of a manure storage or process wastewater containment storage structure. And that structure where an overflow is occurring must be designed, constructed, maintained to contain all the manure that is generated at that site, plus any runoff or direct precipitation from a 25-year, 24-hour storm event. And also the production area has to be operated in accordance with their inspection, maintenance, and record keeping requirements. So if the farm's not keeping up with their inspection and proper recording of their record keeping requirements that are outlined in their permit, then again, this discharge would not be allowed. And then the last thing I have on here is that the discharge complies with surface water quality standards. So that's our zero discharge under limited circumstance requirement. So there's also this zero discharge under limited circumstances that applies to new source swine, veal, or poultry operations. The reason I have this on a separate slide is that I'm not going to say that there's not limited circumstances as to which a discharge is allowed. It's just a lot more restricted for these types of operations. So overall, I would say that these types of operations may not discharge manure or process wastewater from the production area, period. So there may be some sort of exceptional extenuating circumstances with which this is allowed, but it's a lot more restrictive. So I'm going to talk a little bit about CAFO outdoor vegetated areas. These types of areas are what we call ancillary service and storage areas. So these are the kinds of areas on the production site that don't actually handle livestock or manure or process wastewater. So it could be anything from like access roads, any type of oil or vehicle equipment storage areas. So they're connected to the production area, but we don't consider them a part of the production area. And from these areas, discharge of stormwater is allowed as long as that they're not exceeding any sort of groundwater or surface water quality standards. And a CAFO outdoor vegetated area is considered one of these ancillary service and storage areas. So as I wrote down here, it's not part of the production area, and it's defined as a large open outdoor vegetated area of land used by CAFO animals that is owned and operated by a CAFO and is adjacent or directly connected to that production area. So essentially, these are pastures. The only difference between this and a pasture is that they're operated by a CAFO operation and they're directly connected to their production area. So if there are CAFO operations utilizing these types of areas on their farm, they need to implement the following practices that I have outlined up there. The biggest one of these is that we want to make sure that they're sustaining sufficient vegetated cover over the entirety of these areas. They must prohibit direct access of animals to surface waters or wetlands in these areas or adjacent to these areas, and they have to comply with any other measures specified in their permit to prevent exceedances of ground and surface water standards. And then the last kind of standard requirement in NR 243 for CAFOs are the emergency response and mortality management. The emergency response plan is something that needs to be developed by the permittee 30 days after the permit has been issued. It should include names and telephone numbers of people that are identified as responsible in case emergency does happen. So basically something on the farm where the employees and the farmer can actually go to and know exactly who they're going to call in case something does happen. They should also identify any areas of the production area where potential spills may occur, and also kind of where any surface or subsurface drainage points are in relation to those areas, just so they know where to kind of react to in case something happens. And the last thing in this emergency response plan that they should definitely have are procedures that need to be followed in case something happens. So just anyone who's on site has access to this plan so they know exactly what to be done in case a spill or discharge is occurring. Mortality management is not as formal of a plan as what an emergency response plan. We just require that the permittee maintain records of mortality management and disposal methods. Okay, so nutrient management in NR 243. So NR 243 has a variety of nutrient management requirements that are specific to CAFOs. The permittee shall submit a complete nutrient management plan along with a permit application. So every 5 years, that's the length of a permit term, they need to submit a complete 5-year nutrient management plan along with their application. This nutrient management plan shall conform with nutrient budgeting, soil test recommendations, application practices, and any restrictions contained in NRCS 590 standard, and also comply with NR 243.14. So NR 243.14 is the section in our code that is specific to nutrient management plans for CAFOs. It's important to know that NR 243 includes NMP requirements that are far more restrictive than what's in 590 alone. So in certain circumstances, NR 243 can supersede what's in 590. And lastly, on this slide, in addition to submitting a complete 5-year nutrient management plan along with permit issuance and reissuance applications, this NMP shall be reviewed and amended by the permittee on an annual basis so that they can reflect any changes that may need to be made if there's any sort of substantial changes in their operation. NR 243 has a variety of restrictions for nutrient management planning. One of the big ones is the phosphorus restrictions. The most important thing with this is that the permittee is supposed to assess and minimize the potential for any sort of phosphorus delivery to waters of the state from their land application sites. And our code provides them with two different methods for doing this. There's the soil test phosphorus method or the phosphorus index method. And both of these are outlined in 590, NRCS 590. So a lot of the technical details for how these methods work are in NRCS 590. There's also a variety of manure application restrictions. Our code, I think we have a list of 13 different manure application restrictions. I've included 2 on here. These 2 I think are pretty unique to CAFO operations, so that's why I've included them on here, but just note that there are a significant amount more that are in our code. So this first one here is kind of similar to the 0 discharge requirement that we have for the production area, but it's more specific to land application sites. So basically manure or processed wastewater may not run off the application site nor discharge to waters of the state from that land application site unless they're complying with the restrictions in NR 243 plus their permit, and that runoff or discharge is a result of a rain event that's a 25-year, 24-hour storm. So that's kind of the limited circumstance for the land application discharge requirements. And then I also put on here that manure or processed wastewater may not be applied on areas of a field with the depth of groundwater or bedrock less than 24 inches. So that's something that's a little bit more restrictive for CAFO operations. Sure.
Can you tell us about what's the 25-year, 24-hour storm event around here? How many inches is it?
So the question is what the 25-year, 24-hour storm event is in Eau Claire County. Yep. Off the top of my head, I don't know what that is. I think most of them are around 4 or 5 inches, somewhere in between there. I know NR 243 provides an entire table for each county as to what the actual 25-year, 24-hour storm event is.
I believe Eau Claire County is 4.6 inches, but I'd have to double check.
Okay. Any other questions while we're at it? No? Okay, so CAFOs are also required to follow some SWCMA restrictions. And a SWCMA is a surface water quality management area. So this is an area that's either within 1,000 feet of a lake or a pond, or 300 feet from a river or a stream. So that's a SWCMA area. And CAFOs are required to select a specific type of application strategy when applying manure in these areas. And NR 243 provides, I think it's 5 different types of strategies that are allowed for SWCMA areas, but I've included 2 here because I would say 99% of the time, one of these 2 are going to be selected. The first one is that they will not apply manure or processed wastewater within 25 feet of that waterway, and then they'll immediately incorporate or inject manure in the rest of that SWCMA area. So that's the first option that they could choose. Or they would say that they're not going to apply manure or processed wastewater within 100 feet of that waterway, and then they could potentially surface apply in the rest of that SWCMA area. So that's another specific restriction for CAFO operations. Okay, so CAFOs also have to follow a series of restrictions when it comes to winter applications. So before I kind of get into this, I'm going to talk about what winter is. There isn't a set date or time of year for winter. We just say winter is considered the time where the ground is either frozen or snow covered or both. So frozen would essentially mean that the soil is frozen anywhere between the first ½ inch or 8 inches as measured from the surface of the ground. And a good rule of thumb for this is basically if the farm can inject or immediately incorporate, we're going to say that the ground is frozen. And snow covered just essentially means any area of the field with a snow amount of probably 1 inch or more, what we'll say snow covered is. So if those conditions are present, then it's winter. So there's different restrictions when it comes to applying solid versus liquid manure. I'll talk about what the restrictions are for solid manure. If the ground is frozen, surface application is allowed, but just under more restrictive criteria. So we do provide a specific table in our code, NR 243.14, Table 4, that provides this more restrictive criteria for applying solid manure in the winter. If the ground is snow covered and there's less than an inch of snow, surface and immediate incorporation is allowed. 1 to 4 inches of snow, surface application is allowed, again, under that more restrictive criteria in Table 4 in our code. And greater than 4 inches of snow, surface application is allowed, and again, under that more restrictive criteria. But in this case, they cannot immediately incorporate. We also have what we call this manure prohibition period, and this is between February 1st and March 31st. During this time, for solid manure, surface applications are prohibited if the snow is greater than 1 inch on the ground or the ground is frozen. So during this time, surface application is prohibited if those conditions are present. If it comes to liquid manure and the ground is frozen, surface applications are prohibited, bottom line. They can't surface apply manure on frozen ground. If the ground is not frozen and there's less than an inch of snow, surface injection and immediate incorporation is allowed. 1 to 4 inches of snow, injection and immediate incorporation is allowed, but in this case, they can't surface apply. So greater than 4 inches of snow, injection is allowed, but they cannot surface apply or immediately incorporate. And similar to applications of solid manure, we also have a manure prohibition period between February 1st and March 31st. And in this case, for liquid manure, surface applications are prohibited during this time, regardless of the conditions. I also wanted to note that we do have limited emergency application allowance. So these are allowed if the farm does have sufficient amount of storage and for some reason they're going to exceed their storage capacity based on unforeseen circumstances. So like unusual weather conditions, kind of like what we had this fall. We've run into a lot of emergency manure spreading requests just because of the weather conditions this fall. So based on a case-by-case basis, the department may approve any sorts of emergency spreading requests, but there is more restrictive criteria for these. So similar to what we have in that table 4 for spreading like solid manure, there is a similar table in NR 243-14, I think it's table 5, that has more restrictive criteria for emergency spreading requests. Okay, so days of storage. So this is another requirement that NR 243 has, and it basically states that all permittees shall have and maintain 180 days storage for all liquid manure generated at their site. So this 180 days essentially is coming from that winter time period where they're probably not going to be applying a lot of manure, if at all. So that's why we would require that they have 180 days minimum storage to get it through that winter period. And I think the best way to kind of describe this 180-day storage requirement is to look at it in terms of what a typical waste storage facility looks like. So if you're looking at it, here's a typical waste storage facility, and you have to understand that the total storage capacity available to the farm is, you have to take into consideration these other factors before you actually understand how much total storage capacity you have. So if you're looking at the bottom, there's these settled solids. So this is anything that the farm cannot remove from the bottom of the waste storage facility, and that'll take away from their total storage capacity. They also need to maintain 1 foot margin of safety, plus the total capacity that's gonna contain the contaminated runoff from a 25-year, 24-hour storm event. And the reason we have these in here, it's just extra measure of safety to ensure that these waste storage facilities aren't gonna overflow. So we don't want them to exceed these levels. So in addition to this, we require that they install some sort of permanent markers to reflect where these different levels are. So we have the MOS marker, which is the margin of safety marker, and then the MOL marker, which is this maximum operating level. So essentially, it's just a visual that the farm can go and look to make sure that nothing is exceeding that marker, because that's their maximum operating level and storage capacity. We also have a 180-day storage marker. So this is something we ask that they put on into their waste storage facility. So each year, I think it's between October 1st and then the end of November, they have to reach this 180-day storage marker, just so that we know that they have at least 180 days of storage available to make it through the winter. So then everything else between these, where this manure and processed wastewater is their total storage capacity. It does happen occasionally. Like I said, a lot of the cases would probably happen because of some sort of unforeseen circumstance, like there's equipment failure, maybe bad weather that year, and they weren't able to get all the manure out like they'd planned on in the fall, but it does happen.
One more question.
Yep.
All right, so you have a CAFO farm, but let's say you've got 1,000 cow herd.
Okay.
And he builds his storage pit accordingly.
Yep.
Now let's say 5 years from now, he increases the herd another 500.
Right, so the requirement in NR 243 is that once they have 180-day storage, they have to maintain that. So if there's any sort of proposed expansion, then they need to send us updated storage calculations to reflect how many days of storage that they have. And if they, for some reason, fall below that 180-day storage requirement, then we would ask that they submit plans and specifications to build a new storage facility in addition to that. So they can not, once they maintain 180-day storage, they cannot fall below that.
And that would mean they still have to account for the 1-foot margin safety. And
Right, each storage facility should essentially look like this. Any other questions on storage? Yep.
I read someplace that even though you have the best technology and engineering to design that storage system, that there's still going to be a certain amount of leakage. What is an acceptable amount of leakage, and how do you know whether there is actually leakage?
Right, okay. So the question is what an acceptable amount of leakage is allowed from a waste storage facility. So my understanding is that they cannot exceed groundwater quality standards. In certain cases, depending on soil types, I know we can require additional liners to make sure that there's not leakage. We could also require groundwater monitoring, but it's all on a case-by-case basis and what site conditions are for us to require that.
And so would you know, is there a way of detecting that leakage, or you go out and inspect, which is about once every 5 years or something? How would you know whether there was any leakage?
Right. So just by looking at a waste storage facility during a typical site inspection, I don't know if we would necessarily be able to just see that. It's more something that you'd have to be able to detect through like groundwater monitoring to be able to figure out exactly what is happening and how much leakage is occurring.
Okay, so you don't require wells around the property to determine any kind of contamination?
No. So we don't require that. We can include that into permits based on site-specific conditions if we think it's necessary. I know that our storage facilities, they are required to be built. There's a minimum of 2 feet of separation between saturation. So there needs to be a sufficient amount of separation between the waste storage facility and any sort of groundwater or saturation. So that kind of limits that because we do know that there is leaking occurring potentially. But we don't actually require that there's groundwater monitoring included at every operation.
When they have I guess they're kind of monitoring wells, but they're not monitoring the groundwater like up in Chippewa County. Those monitor like if there's 2 pits and they're connected by like a tile line, or like manure can go between pits. Those types of pits need to have monitoring to monitor the leachate that would come out of the tube or the tile running between the pits. That's like 513 is the code, I think.
So there's monitoring there.
Right. When there's something that connects the pits together, if there's more than one.
So then if there's not more than one pit, you said that they can't exceed the groundwater quality standards. How would anybody know if there's no monitoring wells?
Right, that's a good question. Yeah.
So how, is that a law that is impossible to enforce?
To require groundwater monitoring wells?
Is the law that
that manure storage facility can't leach so that it exceeds groundwater quality standards. But if there's no possible way to enforce that, why would you not have a law like that?
Would that be a case of where you would have wells, in other words, there would have to be privately owned wells in the area
Mhm.
that would be exceeding their qualifying with whatever other contaminants, and then could it be traced to that manure?
It's possible that we could trace it back to that and to a specific facility, but it is very hard to prove any sort of well contamination, and we've had problems with that in the past.
Anything stopping a county from requiring?
That I can't answer. I don't know.
It's a local state standard. I mean, you can put it in your ordinance, but someone can just take you to court and be like, this isn't.
Well, I guess that's why I'm asking if there's, like, it sounds like there isn't even exists the state standard.
Right. The only thing that we have in our code that gives us authority is to require groundwater monitoring on a case-by-case basis based on any sort of risk to groundwater contamination that we see.
Has that happened?
Yes, it has.
Yeah. And I'm thinking in my recollection that down there in the town of Sylvester and Green County, because they built a lagoon over what they call a perched lake,
Mm-hmm.
that they required wells to
Okay,
monitor,
yeah.
but it wasn't necessarily for the leakage, it was more for
The perched water condition.
for the groundwater levels, something like that.
Right. Yep. So like there's site-specific conditions that could exist that we could require groundwater monitoring, but we need those conditions to be there and be able to know what they are in order to implement it into a permit. It's not something we can just require for all CAFO operations.
And I think that up here in Chippewa County, I think they put some groundwater monitoring wells with sand. So I don't know, something to check into.
Is it accurate that all pits leak? I mean, to some degree.
That I can't answer for you. I mean, I don't know. I know that there's been studies done and that there is, based on those studies, there is some sort of leakage out of most, if not all pits, but I'm not an engineer and I don't want to pretend to be, so.
It might be useful to know a little bit about how waste treatment plants in a municipal and industrial setting are regulated. Whether or not you add monitoring wells depends on how elaborate the sealing process is. If it's concrete tankage, usually there's no monitoring wells because they figure if it's like a holding tank at that house, you know, it's tightly engineered. Where they do require monitoring wells is when the engineering isn't quite so tight, especially if it's something older and there's any questions or doubts. That's when the monitoring wells go on. So this case-by-case business is a function of how tightly engineered the seal is in municipal industrial settings, and it sounds like that's been carried over to the CAFOs. That's why it's case-by-case.
So what is the new highest technology for these pits? I mean,
In terms of liners,
you know, what are the liners? What are they? Do they typically have more than one or two liners?
If I may ask you this question, which I think might get into your question, Eleanor. The current CAFO standards for manure storage structures,
mm-hmm.
do those follow the current updated NRCS standards, or is it the older standards in NRCS?
So the NRCS standard in our code for waste storage facilities is NRCS 313, and I think it's 2005 version. And because that's the version that's cited in our code, we cannot require them to design a waste storage facility according to the current NRCS 313 standard, which does have a little bit more restrictive criteria in terms of the liners and separation distances.
So I think that leads to your question. The current NRCS standard of 313, which is adopted last year, has more restrictive features for groundwater protection. DNR's code is not yet there. Our current animal waste storage ordinance does follow today's standard. So there is new engineering built into the standard which addresses some of those older structures, try to make them better. So that kind of leads to.
Yeah, except there's a lot of them out there that are older and
Right, but the thing is that a lot of counties do require that any new waste storage facility be designed to the most current standard. So even though DNR doesn't necessarily require that, we know that they wouldn't be able to build that waste storage facility because the county does require the more current version. Right. Yep.
And it exists today in our code.
of course that doesn't take into consideration all of the old pits that are out there. That's probably what the problem is.
Okay, any other questions on waste storage facilities? No? Okay, so I'll talk about NR 243 inspections, record keeping, and reporting. So the permittee is responsible for doing all sampling of manure and soil. So this includes any soil samples for their land application sites, as well as any manure or processed wastewater that is planned to be spread on those sites. So they're responsible for doing all those soil samples and manure samples. They also have to do a series of self-inspections to determine permit compliance. So it's kind of a self-reporting system. And the two biggest things that they're supposed to be looking for is that they have these daily inspections of all water lines. So essentially they're supposed to just go out every day, take a look at what's going on at the farm, making sure everything is functioning correctly and nothing's leaking or discharging, just having those daily inspections completed. They're also required to do weekly inspections of their waste storage structures. So they should be looking specifically at the berms of those structures, making sure that there's no signs of structural weakness, maybe any leakage, erosion, cracks, anything like that. So just taking a look to make sure everything's looking good there. And they're also supposed to be recording any sort of the levels in their waste storage facility and reporting those and making sure that they actually know how much capacity is available to them. So those are the two kind of biggest things in terms of self-inspections that the farm is responsible for. They are also required to submit annual reports and NMP updates every year. Annual reports are due January 31st of each year for a CAFO operation. These reports include summaries describing any proposed changes that they have at the farm, so any sort of construction that they have planned or any sort of expansion, they need to include that in their reports. Updated animal unit calculations, updated days of storage calculations. We want to make sure that they're maintaining that 180-day storage requirement, so they need to submit those every year. And then they should also submit the records that they're keeping. So when they're going out and doing these daily and weekly inspections and keeping records of them, they're supposed to submit those to us to make sure that they're actually doing what's required in their permit. And then NMP updates, those are due March 31st of every year. And those are essentially, like I talked about before, how they are required to update and review their NMP every year. So they should make any necessary changes to that NMP and submit it as part of this NMP update. And then also submit any sort of land application activities that took place that year. Okay. NR 243, design, submittal, and approval. So before I get into the design, submittal, and approval process on DNR's end, I'm going to talk about what a reviewable facility is. So this is sort of any structure or system that's associated with storage, containment, treatment, or handling of manure or processed wastewater. So anything from like runoff controls, feed storage, permanent spray irrigation, groundwater monitoring systems, manure storage or manure transfer lines. Those are all things that we consider reviewable facilities. No worries. Okay, so plan and spec and department approval. So plans and specs for any reviewable facilities need to be submitted to the department for approval prior to beginning construction. And basically what we're looking for is that we want to see that these systems or facilities are designed and constructed to meet the production area discharge requirements. So again, that's that zero discharge under limited circumstance requirements. We want to make sure that these facilities are designed to meet that requirement. They also need to be designed to meet our storage requirements, that 180-day storage requirement. So those are the things that we're looking for through our review process. And once those are submitted, the department has a 90-day review timeline to actually make a final decision on those plans and specs. Okay. Then evaluations of reviewable facilities. So the department does have the authority to require evaluations of any existing reviewable facilities that are currently on a farm. And there's a couple different scenarios in which we probably would require an evaluation of something that's existing. The biggest one is that if this is a first-time issuance of a CAFO operation, we'll probably know that since they hadn't had a permit in the past, that all their existing reviewable facilities were not previously approved by the department. So in that case, we'll probably require evaluations of all those facilities just to make sure that they're meeting our permit requirements and that zero discharge requirement. So that's probably the biggest way in which we would require an evaluation. We could also require evaluations of things that were previously approved by the department if they are meeting a variety of different factors that are outlined in our code. And one of the biggest ones that we would require an evaluation of something that was previously approved is maybe the age of the facility. So if, say, something's been existing for 20 years, we see a waste storage facility that's 20 years old, we'll probably just ask to make sure that that's evaluated to make sure that it's meeting that same permit requirement. And then once we actually do review those, the department has the authority to require any additional action on the permittee. So we may see that something's not complying with our permit requirements and our code requirements. So we could ask them to do anything from upgrades, replacement, or even closure of those facilities. Okay. Go to the next one. So before I get into the permitting process, I kind of discussed like a basic overview of our regulations in NR 243. Any questions on any of those requirements before I get into this? Yep.
I have a question about the reporting.
Yep.
They're supposed to do this report on their nutrient management number by March 1st.
It's March 31st, yep.
On March 31st. And I attended that EPA meeting where it was made public that there was no record of these reports, and that many people were not reporting with them, they were reporting with the state.
Okay.
Has that been worked on, and is there now more transparency and making those reports available?
Yeah, absolutely. So the question is that there was concerns that CAFOs weren't actually submitting these annual reports like they were supposed to, and that the records are being lost. Okay. So as of last year, all annual reports and NMP updates are being submitted through our e-permitting system. So everything submitted through that system is available to the public. So not only do we have a better way of tracking to see whether or not those are submitted, the public also has access to everything that is being submitted to the department. And I did provide links to that e-permitting site so you guys can go and look and see everything that's being submitted.
I don't understand through the permitting process. So how does that?
It's called e-permitting. So it's basically each program in this e-permitting system through DNR has a set of different types of submittals that can be submitted. So for the CAFO program, we require all permit applications, NMP updates, annual reports, any sort of NMP substantial revisions. We have a series of different things that can be submitted through this online process, and anything submitted is available to the public. And it's definitely helped us in keeping track of those records and making sure that nothing's being lost. So everything's available online through that database.
And so now there's a better record, and also that keeping track of everybody that's.
Absolutely. And we do have additional LTE staff who are going through and actually tracking a lot of these NMP updates and annual reports. So not only are they taking information out of these reports and kind of tracking specific information, they're seeing which facilities are submitting them and which aren't. And then they're contacting the regional specialists to see if we need to follow up with the farm to make sure that they get us that information.
So you do have a follow-up.
Yep.
And a follow-up question to that. What percent of the annual NMP updates and the annual reports get professionally reviewed? Somebody, I'm pretty sure you probably can't do them all, but is there some
Right.
percentage that get reviewed?
So I wouldn't say that there's a specific percentage that we are required to do a formal review on. I would say though that region specialists, they kind of are familiar with the facilities and which ones have had issues that year and anything that they need to look for in those reports. So that's a good way for a regional specialist to follow up on something. So say like a spill had occurred that year for a specific facility, then the regional specialist kind of tracks that through their own tracking mechanisms, and then we'll check on things through their annual report and do a more formal review that way. But in terms of doing a set percentage of annual report and NMP update review, we don't actually do that.
But before they get submitted, do you remember when we were at the Dairy CAFO in Southern Eau Claire? Cindy talked from Black Valley Ag. So if you're gonna do a nutrient management plan for a CAFO, you have to have a specific certification with the state. You have to have a TSP, and that's like another extra amount of training. So not only do you have to have your certified, you need to be a certified crop advisor, but then you have to go and you have to have your TSP. So there is training for those people who do the nutrient management plan for the CAFO. And then those get put into SNAP Plus in that 5-year plan. So there is somebody with a professional background who does those initially.
I think it's not the initial, it's the reports that they're supposed to do.
Well, I was curious, you know, the annual reports are supposed to prove that the nutrient management plan was followed. But if nobody's got the time to review them, then
Right.
they don't serve a whole lot of function.
And like I said, as of last year, since things have been coming through our e-permitting system, I did mention that we have these additional LTEs who are tracking and pulling certain information out of that. So there is some sort of preliminary view that is being done on all of these NMP updates, but there's not like a formal in-depth review on all of them. There is a preliminary review process, but not something that's reviewing every little detail within these NMP updates, unless the regional specialist knows that there's an issue at a specific facility and takes the time to review that on a case-by-case basis. Any other questions before I talk about the permitting process? Okay. All right, so there's two different types of permitting processes. There's the first time issuance of a farm that's not previously permitted, and then reissuance of a currently permitted operation. So the process for both of these is pretty much exactly the same with some slight differences. So a first time issuance, in theory, this would be an operation that has less than 1,000 animal units and is wishing to expand and therefore is applying for a permit. So the first step for them would be to submit a preliminary application 1 year prior to reaching that 1,000 animal unit number. That preliminary application is supposed to notify the department that this operation is interested in becoming a CAFO and that we need to begin the permitting process. So then the next step on our end would be to go out there and conduct what we call a site walkover inspection. And basically this inspection is to get out to the farm, kind of get familiar with what they have going on there, discuss any planned changes that would come up in this next permit term, and also to kind of discuss what our permitting process is with them so they kind of know what they're in for. We'll go walk around, look to see if there's any sort of issues that need to be addressed immediately, any sorts of discharges that are occurring right when we're on site, and determine if there's any existing reviewable facilities there that need to be evaluated. So because this is a first time issuance, we would probably require that everything at that site that's considered a reviewable facility be evaluated before we issue them a permit. Then the same kind of goes with the reissuance inspections. It's pretty much a similar inspection. The biggest difference is that we're going to determine whether or not that facility is in compliance with their current permit, because if there's any sort of compliance issues, we want to make sure that those are addressed before we begin that reissuance process. So then once we actually do either that site walkover inspection or that reissuance inspection, we'll send out an inspection report. And in that report, we'll include a list of application materials that are required for a complete final application. And this is a pretty standard list that would probably be required for all CAFO operations. So we'd have like the application forms. These would be just forms that provide us with general contact information, general site-specific information that would provide us with what the reviewable facilities are at that site, with any proposed expansions, that kind of information. We'll also require that they submit those animal unit calculations. We want current animal unit numbers as well as any proposed. If they're proposing to expand, that's basically what we're looking for. We want labeled aerial maps, so we kind of have a spatial representation of what the facility looks like, what their current facilities are, and then also delineate any proposed reviewable facilities. We could require an environmental analysis questionnaire. That's something we would determine on a case-by-case basis, but that's something that could be required as part of an application. We would ask that they submit their 5-year NMP, also their 180-day storage calculations, as well as supporting documentation to show how they're calculating those numbers. Any engineering evaluations that we required as part of that inspection, so we would have told them which facilities that they need to be evaluated, and then any plans and specs for anything that they have proposed. So that's what a final application would look like. Okay, so then once that application has been submitted, our CAFO intake specialist will do a completeness review of that application, and then once they determine that it's complete, they will send it off to the applicable reviewers for a review process, and then it will also be available through that e-permitting system. And here's where I included the link to that system. I think it's in this PowerPoint a couple other times. So once the intake specialist pushes that on for review, then it will also be available to the public to access, and they can download any information included in that application. So then the CAFO review engineer will review the 180-day storage calculations, any engineering evaluations or plans and specs that were submitted, and then the CAFO NMP reviewer will review that 5-year NMP. And then prior to drafting a permit, the CAFO specialist, which is my role, would track the status of any of those review processes that are going on. So they're going to wait for the approval of those 180-day storage calculations. They want to make sure that they wait for a decision on any engineering evaluations. So as I mentioned before, the department can require additional action based on the review of an evaluation. So if additional action is needed, we want to make sure that we'd include that in our permit as a requirement to kind of get any issues resolved through that permit term. We'd wait for the approval of an engineering plans and specs, and then the approval of a 5-year NMP. Then here's kind of the process in a flowchart version. This process takes at least 6 months. So this is why we require that for first-time issuances that they submit a final application 6 months prior to becoming that CAFO size, that 1,000 animal units, or they need to submit it 6 months prior to their current permit expiration date if this is a reissuance.
Is this 6 months in addition to the 90 days that you have when you initially submit things?
Are you talking in terms of the plan and spec review timeline?
Yeah, because wasn't there something that you had 90 days to review something?
Yep, so any plans and specs that are submitted have a 90-day review timeline on them. So that would be included in the 6 months.
Part of this.
Yep, so that application is submitted, and then we do all of our review process, so any plan and spec review, and then this section sort of encompasses both that storage calculation and any evaluation review. We'll have those review and approval processes, the nutrient management plan approval, and then once all of those things are kind of coming together, I just talked about this a little bit, then we'll begin drafting the permit. And then when a permit's drafted, we'll send it out for a 30-day public notice period. Either we'll have a hearing scheduled already if we know it's going to be requested, or we'll wait for a request for a hearing. Either way, if it's needed, we'll do a hearing. And then we'll respond to any comments that were received by the public. And then once all that's taken care of, we can issue the permit.
This is the Cranberry Creek situation where the owner of the farm, or the person that was requesting the permit, listed all of the acreage that was available for the manure spreading, and listed a lot of properties that weren't actually, well, not actually gotten permission to spread. So has the department tightened up the rules there so that there has to be some kind of paper signed by the owner of the property, or that you're actually getting permission from the owner instead of the renter? What has the department done to tighten that up a little bit? So
Right.
you don't have this horrendous mess and you have to prolong the hearing and actually have another hearing and then actually allow them to go out and find the proper amount of acreage.
Right. I don't know if there's anything that we've done on our end to kind of tighten that up. I don't think we can necessarily require that there's formal contracts between the farm and these landowners where they're spreading manure. I don't know if that's something we can require in our code. I know that's something we're just more aware of now. We do have the ability to request additional information during these review processes. So I think now that we're aware of it, I don't actually review the NMPs, that we have separate staff that do that. So I can talk to them to see if there's anything specific as to what they do to kind of address that issue. But this is why this public comment period is so important, because we do receive a lot of information that could change the outcome of this permit.
Yeah, it leads to a lot of trust in the process when we have
Right.
a bunch of farmers coming in and saying, you know, we have no agreement with grassland for this spreading manure out. So
Right.
it would be something I would think they would want to improve that process.
Right. Like I said, I mean, we are more aware that this has happened now. That Cranberry Creek was a huge issue, and it was probably the first time that this has really ever come up. So now that we are aware of it, I don't know if there's something specific that our NMP reviewers are doing to kind of address that, but I can talk to them and see if there is anything and maybe get back to you.
And with our attorney and our banker, we had to redo our leases this year, and it's specifically in wording in our lease that manure application is or is not allowed.
Okay.
That was something that our attorneys put in. They actually put it in the paragraph where they're talking about, you know, use of pesticides and commercial fertilizers. They actually put in there that the spreading of manure is allowed on this property following state code. So it is coming into their written leases.
Well, that's reassuring to hear. Yeah, but I mean, we do allow just verbal agreements. That is something that we don't have authority to say that they can't do it that way. So
Yeah, so ours were redone in 18, so it was after that Cranberry Creek stuff. So some people anyways are requesting it in there. In their written leases.
that's good to hear. Okay. So this is the last slide I have on here. I don't think I'm going to go into this in its entirety and go through every little bullet point on here, but the biggest point I kind of wanted to get at was talking about the differences between non-permitted farms, so like the smaller operations that are required to follow the regulations under NR 151, and then possibly like a livestock siting ordinance, and then what larger farms who are required to follow the WPDES permit requirements in NR 243. So what are the biggest kind of differences between those two regulations? So I kind of talked about the applicability already versus smaller unpermitted farms versus CAFO farms. In terms of nutrient management, under NR 151, it's NRCS 590 is the code or the standard cited in that code for developing a nutrient management plan. In terms of CAFO operations, they are required to follow that NRCS 590 standard, plus all the additional requirements in NR 243. And some of the more restrictive requirements, like I had talked about, like winter spreading restrictions, and then there's also like additional setbacks requirements that are more restrictive for CAFO operations. So storage design, we did talk about this a little bit. Under the Ag Performance Standards with NR 151, they're required to follow that NRCS 313 standards. And then similar to the NMP, CAFO operations are required to also follow that NRCS standard plus any additional requirements that are specified in NR 243. And the biggest one here is that they also have to meet that additional 180-day storage requirement. So that is a more restrictive requirement for the CAFO operations. In this runoff control section, I think the biggest thing that I want to point out here is that you'll see under NR 151, it says no significant discharge, whereas in CAFO WPDES permits, it says no discharge. And it's in quotes because it's no discharge under that limited circumstances. So their runoff control structures need to be implemented to kind of address these two differences. So NR 151, they can't have a significant discharge, and the runoff controls need to address that. And then CAFOs, they can't have any discharge. So no discharge under limited circumstances. In terms of sampling, NR 151, there's soil sampling that's required for their land application sites under NRCS 590. CAFO operations, they also have to meet those soil sampling requirements, but in addition to that, NR 243 requires that they sample manure and process wastewater that they're actually applying onto their fields. And the last one I'll talk about is reporting. So NR 151 may require some sort of reporting requirements as part of like a cost sharing program or maybe a manure storage ordinance, but there's usually some other element in place to require those reporting. But for CAFOs, they are required to do an annual report for their entire operation in their production area plus their NMP updates every year. So that is a requirement in their permit. And basically, like I said, the biggest thing I wanted to kind of accomplish with this comparison table is to compare and contrast some of the more restrictive requirements for CAFO operations. And that is all I have for you guys. Yes.
I want to really thank you for this table because it answers a lot of questions that have been on my mind for a while. One of the things this group is going to be probably trying to decide is whether to go with livestock sighting or not. And there's one thing that comes into play here that's different, and that's under the runoff control. Maybe this is a question for Greg. The extra thing that comes in says, except no overgrazing for surface water only. That is a new thing or a different thing that comes into effect. Livestock sighting is in effect. Either of you know what that means?
Within livestock setting, I'm not sure. Under NR 151, there is surface water which does not allow overgrazing of stream banks. It's not a specific runoff control. It's a stream bank and lakeshore protection, no overgrazing, so that there's any. In essence, the banks need to be maintaining vegetation. And it's not specifically a runoff control.
No, well, that's part of the 4 prohibited practices everywhere. This one's got me a little puzzled. I'm just wondering what that means.
I'm not sure. That would be a good question for Chris Clayton with the Department of Agriculture.
Well, I think that would be useful because eventually we're probably going to get to debate whether the county wants to do that or not. And that's one of the differences in the two, having sighting or not having it, is whatever that means.
Any other questions for me?
I do have one that's sort of off this a little bit. There was a recent court case between dairy businesses and DNR over, I believe, bringing in one of these new technical standards for feed leaching. And Is that a situation where DNR wanted to use the most recent technical standard? Or what was that battle about?
Okay, you Paul? Okay, you did email me about this. So did you just want kind of an overview of what the,
Well, what was the
There-
disagreement about? I mean,
okay.
what's the deal?
So I guess I'll go back to, I think it was a few years ago. I don't know exactly when this happened. It was at least a few years ago that EPA did a study on vegetated treatment areas, or VTAs. Does everyone know what that is, or do I need to explain what a VTA is? So it's essentially a runoff control system that's usually constructed down gradient of like a feed storage area, a calf hutch area, so that any runoff from those storage or calf hutch areas, any nutrients that's collected in that runoff will flow onto this vegetated treatment area. And the idea is that the vegetation on that area is going to take up those nutrients and that it's not going to discharge. So EPA did a study on these vegetated treatment areas and found that a lot of them weren't functioning the way that they were designed to, and that discharges were occurring and that there were some groundwater issues with them. So based on this study that EPA did, DNR was going out and doing inspections and found that there were a lot of vegetated treatment areas being used as runoff controls for calf hutch areas. Require evaluations of these structures because we just wanted to see whether or not, in fact, they were meeting our zero discharge requirement. So because we were going out there and just kind of requiring evaluations based on this settlement, DBA came back and said that we were assuming that discharges were occurring instead of actually having documentation that they were in fact happening, and that we didn't really have a basis for requiring an evaluation of these facilities.
So it wasn't really that a new technical standard.
Right.
It's just responding to this EPA investigation.
Right, and DNR put together a couple guidance documents to kind of address these issues. So when we require these evaluations, a lot of them were coming back as not being compliant with our code requirements, and that additional action was required by the permittee to upgrade these structures. And a lot of the permittees were going to 100% collection because just that was the lowest risk option for them. And we were putting together guidance documents to basically give an idea of how they could address any issues if in fact their evaluations of the VTA was coming back as non-compliant, and as to what they can do. And I think one of DBA's arguments was that we were requiring 100% collection for runoff control features based on these guidance documents. Does that make sense? Okay. Any other questions for me, or? Okay. Thank you, everyone.